From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to today's program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. It has been nearly 3 weeks since a train carrying toxic chemicals derailed in Ohio, the United States. Is it a local tragedy or an international disaster? Let's first of all take a look at how the tragedy unfolded.
The incident occurred at the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. The train had 141 fully loaded cars, 20 of which were carrying hazardous chemicals. An accident occurred when the train reached East Palestine, Ohio, and caught fire. It was passing a factory when the bottom of the train began to burn. 38 cars were derailed and 12 more damaged in the ensuing fire. 5 of the derailed cars were carrying vinyl chloride, a highly flammable substance. It has been linked to a rare form of liver cancer as well as other cancers, including leukemia. There are many residential areas within 100 meters of the derailment site. On February the 4th, the government issued a mandatory evacuation order for some 1,500 to 2,000 people. 2 days later, the evacuation zone was expanded to cover all residents within a 1 to 2 mile radius. Residents who were not evacuated witnessed a huge mushroom cloud. A thick plume of black smoke was visible on that day. A few days later, some 3,500 fish were reportedly dead in local waters, more than 7 miles away from the site. However, the evacuation radius for local residents were only 2 miles. On the same day, local residents were told they could safely return to their homes. 10 days after the derailment, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation finally responded, saying in a post on Twitter that he was concerned about the impacts on the families. However, the cloud of concern is still hanging over the town.
Now, who's responsible for this crisis, and is it now snowballing into greater consequences? For more discussions, I'm joined at this hour in Shanghai by Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University. In New York, we have Anthony Chen, former Chief Economist at J.P. Morgan Chase. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we have Anthony Moretti, Department Head and Associate Professor at Robert Morris University. Welcome, gentlemen. Professor Moretti, if I can start with you. Let's look at this. Norfolk Southern, which was operating the freight train, is one of the largest U.S. rail companies. It has been criticized, of course, for that accident, as well as its handling of the fallouts. Some reports say that the company ignored mechanical failures before the derailment, and some say it was lobbying even to get a safety proposal thrown out. What does this say about the current state of U.S. rail safety and the transport companies' accountability?
Well, I was reading a report that was published on Sunday, it was here in the U.S., that noted that Norfolk Southern and a couple of other rail companies were telling their shareholders that it was possible to reduce costs in order to increase profit margins. And I think those are the kinds of statements that are going to really come back to haunt companies like the company like Norfolk Southern as the investigation continues to unfold, because there are going to be consistent questions about, number one, did you cut corners for safety? And number two, recognizing that deregulation intensity that exists in Washington, D.C. and has for the better part of 4 decades, was there not enough being done on the government side to protect innocent people from an event such as this? I fear what's going to happen is we're going to find out that there was a opportunity to cut costs. There also was clearly not enough oversight by the federal government. As a result, you have this almost perfect storm of events coming together, creating this crisis that we're still dealing with.
Yeah. Talking about accountability, Anthony, in New York, who do you think should be responsible? I mean, we remember the famous quote from Bill Clinton, the former president, back in the 90s, whereby he said, nothing wrong about America cannot be corrected by what's right about America. I mean, in this case in particular, who's responsible? What should have been the oversight that should have been in place?
Well, I think there's no doubt that there were responsibility on the part of government and certainly on the part of the railroads. What we see here is a national tragedy, which I believe will eventually be addressed as people basically start raising their voices and demand that both the railroads and the government do something about preventing a tragedy like this from ever happening again.
But Anthony, we've been dealing with this issue for a while. I mean, reports are widespread about the condition of U.S. rails, aging infrastructure, roads and bridges. We've seen numerous reports of derailment happening at a staggering rates every year. What will be the prospect of fixing this issue going forward?
Well, I think it's going to cost a lot of money. I think you're correct. We get on average about 1,704 derailments every single year. Obviously, not all of them have the same result with hazardous material. But these derailments are occurring, and that's one of the reasons why the infrastructure bill is going to be investing in trying to improve the infrastructure of these railroads. The problem, however, is that not enough money is being allocated. Some studies show that it costs about $2 million for every mile to replace track, and some of the track has to be replaced, or much of it has to be replaced. And of course, in the inner cities, that cost rises to about $300 million to replace the track. And when you see this infrastructure bill, we're talking about $102 billion. And even if you use that very low number, we're talking about numbers that are approaching $300 billion, even at the lower cost range. So you can clearly see that even though we are taking the right steps to improve the infrastructure, the numbers that we're talking about are simply not enough to address the problem. So it's going to have to be addressed not only by government, but also by the railroads to improve the infrastructure and also to make even greater investments.
Yeah, Joseph, let me turn to you. Many years ago, there were talks about fixing and upgrading the infrastructure, the railroad in New England. There were resistance from residents because, after all, some trains would go past the residential areas in New York, Pennsylvania, Boston areas. What is the state of affairs right now? And, really, how has Biden's infrastructure bill been implemented now that we have been, 3 years into the proposal of that bill?
Well, as was noted, the overall numbers associated with the bill are insufficient. There was a push for much bigger numbers, but there was steep resistance in Congress. And so, he ended up getting what he could. We know that Biden has been a longstanding champion of the rail industry. He often made it part of his political brand to highlight that he would take Amtrak in from Delaware to Washington. Disproportionately, the rail industry was being awarded a substantial number of the monies that were legislated for Build Back Better. The problem here, there are two problems here. The first is it's even with the small amount of money, which, as we've said, is insufficient, it still takes a long time for these projects to get underway and to bear fruit. But we shouldn't be distracted from the simple fact that this accident certainly wasn't helped by America's decayed infrastructure, but it wasn't caused by it, right? I mean, it's going to take years and much more money to fix the problem of this infrastructure. But this is really a problem of governance. This is really a problem of regulation and oversight and corporate responsibility.
Yeah, talking about governance, Joe Biden obviously was in Ukraine. The Biden administration told Ohio Governor Mike DeWine that his state is not eligible to receive federal funding, specifically federal disaster assistance for the train disaster. Neither President Biden nor his Transport Secretary Buttigieg has visited East Palestine, but President Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine on Monday and promised additional assistance of $500 million to Ukraine. Joseph, what does this say about his priorities? And from America first, is it now America last, as some are saying? And how are Americans reacting to this?
Well, in the lead up to the State of the Union speech, Joe Biden induced hysteria over an errant Chinese weather balloon, right? This old film, Don't Look Up, really became Don't Look Down when we start thinking about the crises, the real dangers that we're unfolding in terms of this accident. Now, in that speech, Biden named China by name more than any other country, even more than the United States. And what we know is that we've had these meetings in Brussels and the Munich Security Council, where we've had Wang Yi from China teasing a forthcoming peace proposal for the crisis in Ukraine. And this led Blinken to go on to American television to say, no. In fact, Russia or China is going to provide lethal assistance to Russia, and in turn, Biden to visit Ukraine to try to shore up support there, to push back against these Chinese initiatives for peace. So it's very clear what Biden's priorities are. It's very clear what he thinks is the greatest danger to America, and so he's out on those front lines. But it's also clear that Biden is now in a very difficult second half of his first term. His party lost control of the House. That means that his ability to do anything in terms of his domestic agenda is severely limited. He already achieved as much as he could, including what he got for infrastructure. And it's natural for him to pivot to foreign policy because that's really where his powers are unchecked and where he hopes to make hay before he faces re-election.
Yeah, the Ohio derailment is causing a public health crisis of sorts. Here's what people are saying in the area, expressing fears of mass chemical poisoning. Take a listen.
We've been talking about moving somewhere different because it's just, I don't want to risk it. No, like literally before they even did the controlled release, the fish were already dying in the water. It's like, I don't trust that.
I was 8 miles away from where it happened, and I could see the fire and what's going on, and I could smell the chemicals, and it's obvious something's not right.
I don't know that I feel safe because so much now has come out that there are additional chemicals that we needed to worry about. Now we're worried about our water supply. Now we're worried about soil contamination. So I'm not going to say that I feel safe.
We're trying to get information out to our citizens. Everybody's concerned. I'm concerned. But, it's not Norfolk Southern here. It's the EPA, the people that have been working with us, trying to get our citizens back into their homes safe. That's what we need right now. We need our citizens to feel safe in their own homes. I'm very frustrated.
Now, as we speak, there was another chemical plant explosion injuring 14 people. That is about 70 miles, just 70 actually, 70 miles from the derailment site. Professor Moretti, the U.S. Environmental Agency says it is now safe to return. What is your take on this? Why such discrepancy between what we've just heard from the public and the official perceptions?
Well, one of the things we talked about earlier was this idea of this derailment being in part a function of the absence of good governance. It's also, frankly, a reaction or a response to a distrust in government as a whole. For the better part of 40 years, Americans have been, sort of beaten down with this message of that government is the problem. Government can't fix this. Corporate America can take care of itself. And sadly, therefore, what we see is that when the government shows up in a situation like this, offering clear evidence that it can assist, there are a lot of people who simply say, look, you're with the government, we don't trust you. On the other hand, when media report what's going on and they report that the government says, okay, it might be safe to return to your homes, people turn around and say, if the government reports it, it's not accurate, it's not fair, it's part of the deep state, I don't believe it. So what you see in too many situations, and again, East Palestine, I think, is both the sort of best but worst example of all of this. What you see is information that should be believable not being seen as valid. And at the same time, you see an overall decay in the trust in institutions across the board in this country. Again, government, religion, politics, the media, all of these are considered to be infected in some way. And so as a result, when critical information that is valid is presented, it's not taken seriously. So this fear that people have, absolutely understandable. I think to me the biggest fear that I keep reading about is people saying, okay, on the one hand, you're telling me I could return to my home, And on the other hand, you're telling me that the water is safe, but then you're telling people to buy bottled water. That message seems inherently contradictory, and nobody in the government has been able to provide an explanation for, on the one hand, test your water, on the other hand, buy bottled water, without people fearing like there is a deeper, unsettled or not being discussed truth that they're hearing. It's a awful combination of distrust in institutions and fear, justified fear in people.
Yeah, suspicion towards the government has been long established, and now it is more salient than ever, arguably. Anthony, in New York, talking of American reactions, East Palestine residents have filed at least 6 class action suits against Norfolk Southern, the rail company. They say they lost income due to evacuations. They were exposed to cancer-causing chemicals, and they were no longer, safe at home. Do you see this becoming another massive landmark case, like perhaps the anti-tobacco suit in 1998 or the oil spill case in 2010? What could be the social and economic impacts?
Well, I think that it's too early to tell, but there is one thing that is clear, and that is that the people are very angry. They are distrustful, as you just heard the professor say correctly. And then when that happens, you're going to see a real strong reaction from the American people. And so, yeah, there will be lawsuits. There'll be a scrambling from the companies. The railroad companies certainly made more than $3 billion last year, and people will be asking the question as to why are they only putting forth $2 or $3 million to try to improve or rectify the situation, that they should be putting more. So all these questions will be coming up. And with regard to the testing, I agree. They are doing tests, and the preliminary tests do suggest that the water may be getting safer. But I think it's still too early to say that the residents won't suffer long-term harm from these effects. I don't think just testing the water today is enough to assure the residents that if there was some exposure, that 5, 10, or 15 years from now, that they won't suffer from that exposure. I think the evidence is not clear on that front yet.
Yeah, well, Joseph, according to a report by Newsweek, between 1990 and 2021, there were over 54,000 derailments in the United States, which means over 1,700 a year on average. This year alone, so far, there have been over a dozen derailments. So where is President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan passed in 2021 to improve old, decaying infrastructure? Do you see tragedies like this happening again in the foreseeable future?
Well, those numbers on the number of derailments come from the U.S. Department of Transportation itself, which is to say the government knows very well that the nation has this long-standing problem, but has done very little to address it. And as was said before, Biden has long been a champion of the rail industry, and the infrastructure bill, from what I could see, there's a lot of confusing information about how much money will actually go eventually, but there were some estimates that as much as $66 billion would be earmarked for the national rail network. Now, again, that is very, very small in terms of the overall need. But that's good news. But again, it will take years for the U.S. to see results. And as I said before, the cause of this accident, and most of the accidents, has less to do with infrastructure and more to do with deliberately weak regulations and poor enforcement of private industry, which has powerful incentives to cut corners. We know, for example, during the Trump administration, that some of the safety features were hollowed out, that it was argued successfully that they weren't, that the cost far outweighed the benefits. So, I don't think we can blame this accident or most of the others on infrastructure decay. And so what we really need to see is a more aggressive reaction by policymakers. But I think where we're really going to see this, as we generally do, is through the courts. The insurance companies that are responsible for the payouts will raise their rates or require that these companies have safety features going forward. And unfortunately, that's the sort of reactionary type of governance we have in the United States. But in the meantime, the poor residents of East Palestine will wait a long, long time to get any sort of relief if any at all.
Yeah, Joseph, you just mentioned Donald Trump actually is contending for the 2024 presidency, and he just announced that he will be going to Ohio. And is this genuine concern, or has the tragedy become a tool for politics, in the run-up to the elections? How will this incident help or hurt Joe Biden's chances now that his administration is also criticized? His transportation minister, secretary is also criticized.
Well, careful analysis, which won't be common in America's polarized political environment, will show there's ample blame for Republicans and Democrats, including Ted Cruz, who has targeted the transportation secretary, including Cruz's beloved Donald Trump. That said, it's clear that Republicans are now trying to exploit this disaster for two reasons. First, this accident area overlaps two battleground states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, and directly affects a working class area, which both parties are trying to woo.
The so-called Rust Belt.
Now, winning these states is critical for winning the presidency. So the extent to which Republicans can poison Biden's political brand there and beyond is the extent to which Republicans will treat this as a scandal. Second, conservative Republicans hate the transportation secretary, an openly gay member of Biden's cabinet, who publicly married his male partner and adopted children, all hot button issues in America's culture wars. And so, he's often held up as a future high-level leader, and conservatives will certainly try to end his career now before he rises any higher, and then count coup in the culture war.
Yeah, well, let's talk with the safety itself. Professor Moretti, this derailment highlights the dangerous working conditions for many rail workers in the United States. For example, Candace Wagner, a freight rail conductor who ran the governor of Pennsylvania last year, said, and I quote, more companies are running heavy trains increasingly long for profits. On the other hand, they're massively slashing funds for maintenance, inspection, and the workforce. Is that a true situation? Are there supposed to be more oversight for consumers and the environment from relevant government agencies?
Well, there's no doubt about it. One of the things that I think highlighted the sort of neglect that many people in this part of the United States feel about Norfolk Southern is that it took the better part of 2 full weeks for its CEO to come to East Palestine and talk to people about what happened. He actually bailed out of an event that was supposed to happen on a couple of days before that, and that absence of being in town, that absence of talking to people, that absence of hearing their frustrations and their fears, in many ways is symbolic of the notion that, well, you know what? Corporation can simply write a check and fine, well, it'll all go away and we'll all start over and everything will be fine. That sort of flippant attitude that we see too often in times of crisis is endemic of a situation where, again, the feeling is that we really don't want to hold too many people accountable because that is inconsistent with this idea of deregulation. But I think there's something else that Joseph pointed out that I think is really critical to remember here. If an event like this had happened in New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, a major U.S. metropolitan area, the response from the federal government would have been much quicker, in part because the complaining and the concerns of people would have been magnified. The number of voices that would have been upset would have been magnified. And keep in mind that in reality, if the people of East Palestine had not been as aggressive as they were in trying to get people from Norfolk Southern to show up, in trying to get people from the Environmental Protection Agency to show up, it's doubtful whether they would have as quickly as they did. And I say quickly, keeping in mind it was 11 days after the accident before they started to show up. You're right, the president hasn't been there yet. Secretary Buttigieg hasn't been there yet. All of these things lead to the sense that again, this absence of regulation is in many ways perceived by people as a simple absence of caring. And in East Palestine, at least, that has not gone over well at all.
Yeah, we'll see how this incident shapes the electoral landscape in Ohio, a key battleground state. That is a key swing state that is crucial for the election in 2024. Anthony, New York, there's also concern that the so-called toxic cloud from Ohio is moving to other states covering the East Coast and even to Canada. On social media, some are calling this incident an quote-unquote international ecological disaster caused by more negligence and corruption by the U.S. government. Are these simply fears, or is this really happening?
No, we certainly are hearing things like that. We don't live in a vacuum, and so other states that may be in the surrounding area will experience that. You remember when the Japanese had a problem and their nuclear plants melted down, and you saw that some of the toxic materials were going as far as California. So I think that anytime you have a disaster, there is a risk that it can spread. We hope that the controlled burn try to ameliorate that process, but we can't rule it out. These chemicals will flow, and they could go to other areas, whether it be Canada, whether it be to other parts in the Northeast. These are all real concerns, and they highlight the importance of minimizing and preventing these disasters from happening in the first place. That's the important message that we all should take away from what happened in Ohio. This should not happen again, but sadly, it probably will continue to happen again until government either rectifies the regulations that took place. You've all heard that Barack Obama passed some regulations to encourage the ECP, the brakes, the electronic brakes. That, of course, was rescinded by President Trump and not reinstated by President Biden. So clearly now, even though you can't really say for sure that those brakes would have prevented this, it certainly may have helped in easing some of the severity of what happened. So there are many people out there, many players, but the message should be that regulation is important when it comes to safety, and you cannot compromise on safety when it comes to people's lives and the future lives of their children. This is something that we should all take to heart.
Yeah, the role of government, the role of state is highly scrutinized and debated again in light of this incident. And finally, there is a reaction from China, of course. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has spoken. The spokesperson said, "Why is the United States able to spot a balloon 18,000 meters above the ground, but fails to see the toxic mushroom cloud of vinyl chloride over Ohio?" And others are also asking similar questions. Some said J.D. Vance, the controversial politician who became the junior senator from Ohio this year, was everywhere promoting Chinese balloon conspiracies, but he's silent about the cloud of toxic gas hovering over his own state. What do you make of all that, Joseph?
You know, on the one hand, assume that Biden is interested in doing the right thing, and I think generally he is when it comes to domestic policymaking. As I mentioned before, he does face extreme limits in his domestic agenda, given the intersecting institutional, financial, and legal restraints, as well as a wide range of mounting problems that have generally gotten worse, along with intense political polarization. Now, this means he's limited, again, in domestic policymaking, and will naturally gravitate to foreign policy, as other presidents have, where their powers are relatively unchecked. On the other hand, all of these declines in the U.S. make it feel more vulnerable, above all, facing a rising power like China, which is not lost on anyone, has a world-class infrastructure, perhaps the best rail system in the world. So naturally, this leads Biden and others to target China. And I think the logic is
Joseph, I hate to interrupt, but we're running out of time as we speak. Thank you all, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching The Hub on CGTN. Bye and take care.